Session of the Board of Ed to order. As we'd like to say, the hardest working unpaid board in the Commonwealth. Welcome, everybody, and we will get right on with the update on the implementation of the Virginia Literacy Act. Well, I guess I ought to check. Are we live? Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Conway.
Good morning.
Deputy Superintendent for everything.
Well, luckily I'm joined by an actual expert this morning, Dr. Emily Solari from the University of Virginia, who is a nationally known literacy expert. I am very excited to be presenting this morning on the Virginia Literacy Act and both what it is, what it means for the Commonwealth and for our students, as well as what it means for this board. This is a longer presentation, but I thought a useful orientation. And just as a reminder, no decisions need to be made today. This is really a first step and a beginning conversation, of which there will be many over the years to come. I'm Jenna Conway. I forgot to say that I'm officially our Deputy Superintendent of Early Care and Education, but really representing a broad swath of the agency today. This is cross-division, cross-office work with a Deputy Superintendent Ritchie, Assistant Superintendent Hollins, Assistant Superintendent Johnson, Christine Harris, Jill Nagaris, and Carmen Couric from the Learning Team, Kim Basson-Brown from Special Education, Dr. Ortiz and her incredible team at the Office of School Quality, as well as the Learning and Early Childhood team. So it truly takes a village on this effort. I'm representing us today, but please know, since the passage of this law, we've been meeting internally as it affects all of our areas of work. I'm also joined today by Karen Little, who is our new strategic implementation manager, who's supporting us to put this into action. It's a dense presentation, but I think kind of an important level setting for the board, starting first with the why or the need, what the data on literacy tells us about the current state of things in Virginia, a little bit of background on the science of reading and kind of why it matters for kids, then get into detail on the law, the Virginia Literacy Act, defining success. So as we embark on this multi-year effort together, what our vision for 2024 is and what will be different on the ground in the Commonwealth, and then coming back and talking about what happens when, this more specific timeline, talk in more detail about the important role of Virginia literacy partnerships, our partners at the University of Virginia. And then as always, as you know, you hear from me, we do a ton of engagement. And so how I work with my colleagues across the Department of Education to broadly engage Virginia educators across the state. All right, so with many things, I always think it's important to start with the why and a specific definition of the challenge that we face and why it matters so urgently for our kids, all of our students here in Virginia. So there's a few reasons, and you'll hear me offer some detail on this, on why we need a comprehensive law to address literacy in the Commonwealth. As I'll detail over the following slides, we've had declining trends in literacy in the Commonwealth kind of across the board, with some real concerns about opportunity in terms of which groups of kids are most affected. We've experienced significant setbacks as a result of the pandemic and the disruption experienced within our families and our kids, within our education system. We know when we look at the Virginia numbers that we have increasing number of at-risk readers, and reading is fundamentally cumulative. And so when we see early on that kids are at risk, it means we have to act early. Similar, you've heard me say this before when it comes to early childhood, intervening early can not only be more effective, but has lifelong effects. And we know now, and I'll talk a little bit about this, and of course be able to refer to Dr. Solari on questions here. We now know more than we've ever known before about the science of reading and how to effectively teach kids to read. Because we do believe in Virginia we should have a Commonwealth and when we ensure all kids have the ability to read by third grade. And that's really important. I also want to say, as we get into this data, As you'll see, this is a complicated problem with a fairly complex solution. And I think that's really important, right? That this is not about pointing blame at educators, at families, certainly not at kids, but really sort of saying how, as we know more, we can sort of approach this differently and better support our educators. And I think that's always important context. You've often heard me talk about that in early childhood. This is not about going out and saying that programs are not quality, but how do we systematically think about better supporting educators, better supporting families, better supporting kids? And you'll see that as we talk about this need for a really comprehensive solution to do better by our families, kids, and educators. When we look at current literacy results in the Commonwealth, what we see is we have a very high number of kids who are below benchmark. So it's known as the PALS, it's now known as the Virginia Literacy Screener. 1 in 3 kids are at high risk of reading failure. And I think this is really important to kind of slow down and emphasize. I think sometimes you think, well, if I pass the test, it means I'm in a good place. That is not how PALS has historically worked. So if you are not at the PALS benchmark, that is not being kind of at a B or B minus. That means you're at risk of reading failure. And there's a pretty direct correlation between being below that benchmark and not being able to read by 3rd grade. And so we've got a third of kids, K2 students in the Commonwealth right now, at high risk of reading failure. If we expand more broadly, and we've worked very closely with our partners at UVA to do this, and think about a multitude, sort of 3 risk categories versus just this binary sort of, are you above or below the benchmark? We actually see that 3/4 of our kindergarten to 2nd grade students either fall in the high risk or the medium risk category, right? So really, when you sort of look at the data over time, what you see is only 1/4 of kids are pretty well protected. And we can say with some confidence that they're going to be okay by 3rd grade. And there's sort of 3/4 of kids, there's some level of risk happening, right? It's very high. This data is particularly concerning when you think about some of our kids that are more likely to be at risk. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the science of reading, but I think everybody on this board can agree that literacy is one of the most important levers for opportunity. Whether you think about anything from doing well in school to doing well in college and career and life to kind of health and behavioral health and mental health and social outcomes. And yet what you see in this chart is that children from our sort of most historically marginalized populations or subgroups are much more less likely to have the opportunity to read, to learn to read. And you see that you look at this is true in kindergarten, this is true in 1st grade and in 2nd grade. So this is not just, there was a bad year or this is a sort of a setback one time, but kind of across the grade bands for our children that are Black, Hispanic, our English language learners or dual language learners, our children from economically disadvantaged households, and our children with special needs are far more likely to be identified at risk at reading failure. And then, as I'll talk about in a second, experience reading failure as they get into older grades. We also know that there's a direct correlation between risk and then sort of ultimate success in reading. We talk a lot about 3rd grade reading as being kind of this, you've heard the common phrase about this pivot from learning to read to reading to learn. And so the 3rd grade it's also the place where sort of systematically we have our first standard of learning assessment. And the trend in Virginia, as you look at this chart, has really been sort of going in the wrong direction in terms of the number of kids that are passing their reading SOL. You see it sort of drops and then there's an increase. And then obviously right around the pandemic, we have a drop. Some note of optimism in terms of as we have really returned to in-person learning, stabilized as a society, our educators are really stepping up and trying to kind of support kids to kind of catch up in all the ways, social, emotionally, academically. So you see an uptick when you look at 21 compared to 22, but still significantly off from where we were a decade ago as a Commonwealth. These are state, yes, Dr. Holton.
Any explanation or interpretation of the 2012 to 2013 dramatic drop?
The dramatic drop? I don't know about that. I can find out about that.
Was it coincide with a new SOL test and tougher cut scores?
I think that's right. Yeah,
I don't remember, but I think that's
Dr.
I think that's right time-wise.
Yeah. And that's a good point. And I think there's been, whether it's this shift in tests or changes in cut points, there's obviously there's areas of discretion around the state tests. And so the other really important point to note here is if you look at kind of the national test and the extent to which this trend also bears out over the national. And so the NAEP is the national test. This is fourth graders, not third graders, so an additional kind of year down. And what you see is a similar trend of a slight uptick, then some sort of sustained situation, and then a drop. And this is really significant when you think about it, and I think some of you might know this. I've got a fourth grader right now, and it's a pretty significant shift in terms of how much reading goes into the learning across all subjects, not just English and language arts, whether it's lots of reading in math and science and social studies, and the extent to which I'm really seeing this play out, this shift from kind of learning to read to having to be able to successfully and proficiently read all the school day in order to be successful. And so to see numbers like this and know that we've got a significant portion of our fourth graders who are not proficient or above is really concerning. And, while some of us would say, well, of course, this is in part related to the national pandemic, but just another data point here on, while you'll see the yellow is kind of the national average, ours is really more pronounced. And so really sort of thinking through, what do we need to kind of do differently to sort of support this very real drop and in terms of kind of, what is related to the pandemic, what might be related to conditions previously, but more importantly, how do we help and better support our educators, our families, and our kids to catch up? We also see.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, and this is probably not part of where you're headed, and I appreciate the overview of the Literacy Act, but which of the benchmarks, you mentioned PALS as sort of a very good predictor of the ability to read further on, all right? How does that compare as an assessment to, let's say, the SOLs versus NAEP in terms of where Virginia thinks a child needs to be in order to be ready to move on through the grades?
So I know the most about the PALS, which we are doing some work on now to strengthen. I think part of what you'll talk about in the science of reading is the importance of really using assessments that give educators the information they need to tackle the most important aspects of learning to read. And so, we had not made a lot of changes to PALS over a period of time. And I know we'd actually heard some concerns even from school divisions about how well it was actually identifying the children who needed sort of those supports and the extent to which it was giving you the information on how to individualize the support and education. So there is some work to strengthen PALS here. I know that there's discussions this board is going to have around kind of SOL cut scores and alignment there. I generally think the NAEP is a pretty good barometer over time. I'm not sure, Superintendent Bill, if you want to add anything there, but that's probably, the most impartial of these in terms of really where kids are at and a kind of apples to apples comparison across the country.
I guess what I'm not actually asking about the apples to apples, because I appreciate the need to have standard assessments across the country so you can see where you are relative to others. I guess what I'm asking is in terms of, and this is a discussion the board has had before when, actually setting the SOL cut scores. I mean, you put the SOL graph up there as if that was the good measure for third grade, success in reading, passing that or not passing that. I mean, do we still believe that the SOLs are a good measure for, again, not the quality comparison with others, but the absolute, does this child, belong in the next grade? Are they reading at an appropriate level to move on to the next grade? Do we think the SOLs are covering that? Do we think we use PALS data for that? Or do we think it's NAEP proficient?
So that gets to a deeper question, right? I mean, the SOL assessments are rooted in the standards of learning, right? And I do think, and I believe it's up for this board next year, that there is a need to, as we take an additional look at the English and language arts SOLs, a need to strengthen those, right? Which in turn would potentially strengthen, in absolute terms, the SOL assessment. So, it's aligned with our current version of the SOLs. I think we're uncovering, and I'll defer to you, Superintendent Vela, if there's more you want to add here, but I think we're uncovering that there potentially will be a need to sort of strengthen aspects of the SOLs as we do, periodically every few years to align with the research and kind of what are the skills and abilities that we want our students to have.
I guess what I'm asking is, do we think the kids who pass the SOLs really can't read at grade level?
The ones who do pass.
Who pass, do we believe they are reading at grade level or not as a state?
High pass, yes. I mean, I think this comes down to where does one draw the cut point also, right? I mean, the extent to which part of it is if you, depending on where you set that cut point, they certainly do. I think if you, interpret that more broadly, no.
Not quite sure I understood that answer, but that's okay.
I think that's the decision that this board has made sort of historically, like you have said, like, yes, this is the point at which, it means in absolute terms that, a child who scores above this is considered to be reading. I don't think that's a forever designation, right? I mean, I think as we get more information and, even as you look at some of the NAEP results and other things, like it is something for this body to consider. Let's
take it from the other end, and I know you get there in the presentation, or maybe, no, you don't get there. The next speaker does, but the goal right now is to have a child graduating from Virginia high school be college or career ready. Right. Do we believe that if they pass the SOLs, that we would consider them to be college ready? And is that borne out? I mean, how do we know? I'm not looking to pick on this. I mean, I understand why we're doing the Literacy Act to change the way we teach it. But since you brought up the measurement side of it, I'm curious to know, what the professionals think. I mean, because long before this board, this particular group, well, the one, right, the composition just before this set the last set of reading cut scores. I mean, the Commonwealth had cut scores from as long as we've had SOLs, right? Do we think that all of those cut scores were, on target, too high, too low in terms of measuring the ability of the capability of a child to meet the college or career readiness standard when they graduate?
So it's hard to answer that question because I feel like this is the body that makes that decision about where you draw that cut point. I certainly think, in terms of, and we could certainly bring Dr. Loving-Ryder up here to sort of talk about, right? I mean, that's the individual for each of the times that this has come in front of that body who has said, based on the evidence in front of us, here's the recommendation on where you draw that cut point that does, in fact, suggest that the students who score above that benchmark are prepared. I don't know of any evidence to the contrary right now. And I do think, in all transparency around the Virginia Literacy Act, that as we look, and I know we've had this conversation with Dr. Harris and learning, as we take a look again at the standards next year, and then sort of think about, asking ourselves that very question, Mr. Gecker, about is this, do knowing these things mean that you are not only prepared to pass a test at the end of third grade, but to be successful is the question you should ask with, because the SOL tests are rooted in the standards of learning. And so I think it's almost what I hear you saying. It's, it's not only about getting the cut score right, it's about making sure that the underlying standards actually reflect the best science and knowledge about reading too.
And at the end of the day, what we're looking to do is, produce is the wrong word here, but, have a child who is capable of, living life, either first through college or directly in a career. And have we been successful at that?
Yes, and I think that's exactly right, both in terms of the longitudinal piece and as well as, the data is a flashlight, right? Like we also don't want to build a system that's really good at just, a certain test or, whether SOL or NAEP or whatever set of letters. Like it is really, about making sure not only, and then that's why there's a huge emphasis here on curriculum, right? And sort of making sure that it covers the right thing and then making sure similarly that we align our standards of learning as well.
Dr. Siebert, and Ms. Mann, or Dr. Mann, excuse me.
And I'm so obviously learning to shift my division perspective to this perspective, but I think maybe what an idea might help that I've used over the time, help me, I'm not sure if it's helpful to other people or not, is distinguishing between the continuum of leading indicators and lagging indicators. So without a doubt, as having been an elementary principal, PAL scores and the things that you do real time, with reading scores with teachers and instructional assistants, that is a real time indicator that allows a current pivot. You move to SOLs end of year, except for very recently. Again, that's now you're moving down the continuum of lagging indicator, still informative and helpful and gives you a statewide perspective. But in terms of lagging, NAEP is most definitely a lagging indicator. But when the lagging indicator indicates something else along the way, then we want to come back to the leading indicator. So I guess as I've tried to wrap my mind around this in the past, I take it out of the education perspective and I put it into worker safety. A leading indicator is, are our employees wearing their helmets, using their personal protective equipment, not standing on chairs and using ladders and all those kinds of things. That's a leading indicator, tracking that. The lagging indicator, does our workers' compensation go down? And so those. So I don't think it's an or here. I think it's an and. But I think that from the field, the leading indicators are much more actionable. And that's where a lot of the energy and emphasis goes.
Dr. Mann.
That was very helpful. Thank you for that. And I guess the thing that I'm most excited about regarding the act, which I think really goes to the heart of why it feels so difficult to get this right. And we spend so much time perfecting how we measure things. We do not spend enough time perfecting how we prepare people to do this work. And the Campaign for Third Grade Reading have been sounding the alarm for many, many years about the lack of explicit instruction in teacher prep around how to help students learn how to read. We should not be surprised. We should not get misguided and focused on, bars. Bars are important. We need those things. We have an obligation. But if we don't do the work of finding the educators that we need who are licensed to do this work with the skills they need to do it, our children will be underserved. Mm-hmm. And that's the piece that I feel we struggle with, because that's hard. It's hard to do that as the profession is struggling to hold itself together in the aftermath of a pandemic. It's hard. And I'm so excited about what the Act is putting forward, because it gives us an opportunity to focus on that. And that's what we have to keep our eye on. Truly, we could really spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's the precise measurement for this, and not go to the heart of how do we get the right people in front of children so that they can have a chance to learn. And I'm excited about this act for that reason, because I think it offers the promise of that. And that's where we have to double down. I'm happy to understand the data, and the news is bad. Mm-hmm. Let's get to work.
I guess even if the news were less bad, we would still want the act.
Right.
I mean, right, we would, I guess
Yes.
This is put in the context of things are going badly. But honestly, as I understand what we're doing in changing the way we're going to teach reading, we're moving to teaching reading in a way that's more appropriate and broad-based.
Yes, I think that's correct. I would say, though, when you think about how we've approached this historically, right, that the sort of the focus in terms of EIRI and reading intervention has been on sort of those who are at greatest risk. And in that, I don't think we've looked as systematically as we could have, as Dr. Mann noted, about all kids, all educators, all classrooms, right? And this idea that we only needed to prepare some teachers to teach children with reading difficulties, or we only needed to focus on the most underserved schools and communities. And so, yes, what is sort of great about this law is its comprehensive look. And I just think when you look at some of Virginia's data, you'll see where some combination of not identifying all the risk and then this sort of focus on a subset has, led to a situation where we need to think more broadly. And I think that it is a significant amount of work, as I'll talk about, but really critical. If you look at even the evidence, which goes back to, and I think is underlying in some of the work around the campaign for third grade reading, but just the idea that, a significant, nearly all kids can learn to read if well supported to do so. There are some exceptions in terms of children with more severe learning disorders or disabilities, but sort of systematically, we have to think differently, and we have to have a belief system that believes all kids can learn to read, and that we can support all educators to do that, which is sort of not what's currently happening. The other important piece here, and before jumping into the work itself, and just I think a set of slides that underlie some of the complexity of the science of reading and why it does take work is, again, you've heard me talk about similar concepts when we think about early childhood, but just how these early foundational learning really sets the stage for future learning and development. And so, beyond the kind of just the sort of adage out there about learning to read versus reading to learn, again, each year becomes harder and harder if you are not a proficient reader, and we can directly connect sort of kids who are poor readers in third grade to kids who are poor readers in high school, right? And sort of more likely to be retained, more likely to present challenges. I get it. If you cannot read, like a sort of a high school day sounds impossible, right? In terms of that, we know more likely to drop out. And ultimately, it's associated with a whole range of social, emotional, physical, and economic health outcomes. And so it's not just about, one test at one point in time. It's a lagging indicator, as Dr. Siebert noted, that actually sort of carries itself forward, and if not built on a strong foundation, will affect kids for the entirety of their educational experience. So with that, what I'd like to do then is start to talk about just briefly a kind of a primer on the science of reading, in part to demonstrate, because some of us will say, well, if I can just listen to one podcast or make this change, like why haven't we done that? And if you really think about systematically, what is the science of reading? What does this evidence suggest? And what does that mean kind of across the board, across thousands and thousands of classrooms and educator preparation programs that we need to do differently? So lots of things out there, science of reading, not one curriculum, not just a sort of a saying or sort of jargon. It really is about kind of evidence from multiple fields of study that has demonstrated really now for nearly 2 decades, a solid scientific evidence base on how children learn to read, and sort of, again, why there are challenges there. And this science needs to be used to think about both how do you instruct children to read, and then how do you identify reading difficulties so you can then adjust your instruction to meet those needs. There is a ton of evidence on there. We have top experts at higher ed across Virginia, including Dr. Solari, who's presented on this to our superintendents, to our elementary school principals, to others. We also have great reading if the board wants more on this. So I'm not going to sort of go too much into detail, but I do think it's important to note, one, that this is rooted in science, and truly, I think, as Dr. Mann noted, that there's some real work to be done, like that this has not necessarily been fully embraced by higher education, fully embraced by curriculum vendors. And as such, we have a situation where we have not necessarily fully prepared our educators across our K2, K3 system to use the best available information, use the highest quality tools to support kids to read. You may have heard this before. While most folks naturally acquire oral language, that is not true for reading, right? Like, you just can't surround kids with reading and they learn to read. Like, it actually, for at least 80% of kids, it requires intentional, explicit, systematic instruction on a set of factors that is both focused on helping kids understand and recognize words, as well as think about meaning, language, and connection. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the simple view of reading, but oftentimes they also talk about, you can sort of, particularly, right, as all of this board is, as fluent readers, you might say, okay, I look at it, I recognize a word, and not fully understand neurologically all of the steps that it takes to kind of become a skilled reader. And so we use the kind of combination of both academics, educational academics, as well as neurology, and really kind of pinpointing at the earliest stages how the brain learns to read, which is connected to sound and oral language rather than just, words on a page, or, even worse, like asking folks to memorize words on a page, which is not an effective way to teach children to read. The simple, we've got, some fancy graphics here. I didn't realize that we've got an animation. You've probably seen this before. I'm throwing a little math in my literacy presentation here, but important to note, and basically the idea is you present reading comprehension as a product, because it basically implies that if you are zero in area of these areas, like, you're not going to be able to read to understand. So really important, whether it's word recognition, decoding, but developing kids' capacity to assign letters and groupings of letters to sound and make sense of that, while also supporting their linguistic comprehension. And we've gone back and forth, and I think rather than thinking of this as either or, what this graphic and this view on the simple view of reading is that you need both. We need to support our educators to be able to support kids to learn in both of these areas if you want kids to be able to read, to understand. The words you'll often hear are deliberate, systematic, explicit instruction in both of these areas. Simply surrounding children with books, reading to kids a lot is not sufficient. That will help them learn content and concepts and language acquisition, but it will not help them learn to decode and encode, spell, and use those words. This is almost deceptive, though. While I think this is a very useful way of understanding why you need both parts, I also think it sort of belies, if it's simple, why aren't we doing it systematically? And so the next two slides, which I cannot explain in detail, but will defer to Dr. Solari if asked, really start to get into why it is much more complex. And so when there's a reason we call this the science of reading, and as you see, what goes into decoding, right, which is sounding out a word, and encoding, putting sounds together to make a word, is actually quite complicated, and goes to sort of knowing letters and groupings of letters and how those work, right? Being able to spell, and that associated issue between reading and writing and oral language, how print represents sounds, syllables, and meaningful word parts. That's a bunch, and you need systematic instruction there. Similarly, you've got linguistic comprehension as well, and content and sort of themes, and how sentences are organized and how language works, right? All of which you've got to have both of those. And then you're working at kind of how accurately they're reading, how fluently they're reading, kind of are they getting intonation and meaning. It's a lot. And I think that that's important to note as we think about, okay, systematically, how do you bring this to programs, particularly if they haven't been fully embraced in the curriculum that's readily available, or haven't necessarily provided a strong evidence base or kind of experience or educational base in their higher ed preparation. It's a lot. So the simple view of reading is useful to kind of be able to explain to a peer what it is. But when you really think about what we're asking educators to do, it is important to recognize, I think, the work as Dr. Mann noted. And then the even more complicated graphic, but is ultimately, as everybody on this board had to do with the large binders that you get prior to each meeting, it's not just enough to be able to read to understand. You need to be able to really be a skilled reader, and things need to get increasingly strategic and automatic over time to be able to read things, learn new vocabularies, social studies vocabulary, science vocabulary, kind of industrial vocabulary, right? All sort of new words and concepts. And this hinges on pretty sophisticated language comprehension and word recognition skills. So this is Scarborough's rope. I think it does a good job kind of sort of taking what appears to be a quite simple depiction of really showing, if you think about, again, your kindergarten, your first grade, your second grade, your third grade teacher, making sure that they're each day within that core English and literacy art block, bringing systematic instruction, right, to a group of 15 to 25 kids, right, all with sort of differing skills and ability. This is not simple, right? This is complex, and this requires strong foundational training as well as continuing and ongoing professional development in order to support our teachers to do this day in, day out. It requires more than just the classroom educator. It requires the reading specialist, the principal, all the interventionists, right? It sort of takes a systematic approach with sort of, support from central office. And I think as I talk in more detail, you'll see why the VLA is so comprehensive, because we would not be fair to put this on the sort of shoulders, I think as Dr. Siebert and Dr. Mann know, of just one teacher too, right? It really takes all of the teachers, the educators, and the folks who support them across our classrooms to be able to achieve this day in, day out with an incredibly diverse set of young learners. All right. Questions about the science of reading, or Dr. Solari, I'm not sure if you can zoom in, if there's anything you'd like to add that I failed to cover.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not there today. Yeah, only that when we think about the simple view of reading, we shouldn't think about it as simplistic, and that's kind of contrary to the title. But what's interesting is when you kind of look, there's empirical data to support the framework, and that's true across multiple subgroups of children, monolingual English-speaking children, English learners, different subgroups of children. And when you really break it down, back on the previous slide, Jenna, those subcomponent skills that are under the broader decoding and language comprehension skills, those are teaching targets for our teachers, right? So we want to be teaching through those sub-skills in order to get kids to decode well and also comprehend text and have a robust oral language. And so so we can think about this as both instructionally relevant, and also we know that if children have difficulties in these areas early on, then they're at risk for later reading difficulties. So we can think it also through how we're screening and assessing children early.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Solari. Questions about the science of reading? Ms. Holton. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to defer to you, Mr. Gaggard.
Thank you. I'm interested in what percentage of our school divisions, if any, are using curriculum that is aligned with the science of reading and are doing already professional development in service that enables teachers to have these very sophisticated skills in teaching reading. And in particular, so have we done some survey of what's going on out there already? And are there any what I call found pilots? Who's doing it right already, and what can we learn? What results are they getting?
So I'll answer it first and see if Dr. Solari has anything to add on and the work of the Virginia Literacy Partnership. So I think there are certainly pockets that are happening, right? So when you look at, for instance, there's an example of a nationally known training, Letters on the Science of Reading, that I believe Dr. Hollins noted that upwards of 100 school divisions are using in some form or fashion. I don't think, however, that is like systematic. Every educator, every reading specialist, it sort of gets into every classroom. I mean, and again, I think that we have a long history in the state of funding EIRI, putting resources towards kind of targeting those kids in most need, which is important and continues forward, right? The VLA is really meant to work side by side with EIR. So it's happening in some places, but it is not necessarily systematic. And I think that's the big challenge. I think similarly, we're finding out more and more what curriculum school divisions are using, and then the extent to which that is consistent across the board, right? Sort of all classrooms. And is that a school division decision, or is that a site sort of decision? We know that there are places that are using what we believe to be quality curriculum. We've got a process underway to determine that, some of which are products that can be purchased nationally, and some of which are developed by school divisions. So we're trying to kind of get that landscape currently. So I don't think it's fair to say that none of this is happening in Virginia. I think the real shift of the Virginia Literacy Act is to say all kids, all classrooms, all educators across K-3.
So if I may just suggest, you may want to do a little looking for a found model. In reform efforts I've been involved in Virginia before, it's one thing to tell Virginia educators that, somebody in some other state did this. But if you can point to, Hampton was the one I was working with on foster care reform. If they can do it in Hampton, then you can do it here. And I don't know who, if anybody, is doing this here, but I just encourage you to think about that.
No, I think that's absolutely.
And then you can show what results they've got.
I think that's really important. And I think I also think it's critical, at least my understanding of talking to, and we'll talk in a second about sort of hundreds of educators who've reached out to us. For example, folks who have been trained on science of reading really speak about very differently about kind of the power that it has. And I think this is just going to emphasize the point that Dr. Mann made earlier, like, it is about equipping people, right? Rather than sort of an indictment of what hasn't happened. And I think once we equip people with these skills and abilities, it's a game changer. It's truly a game changer. And so we do have examples of that. Ms. Holton, I think that's exactly right. Like, you're better to hear from another Virginia educator who says, I went through this training, this was a difference maker, with my kids. And that is the most powerful testament as we are trying to support more systematic change.
Ms. Creasy.
So as far as professional development goes, I mean, obviously, as complex as this whole process is, this isn't a 1-day, 4-hour PD. So how are we going to continually support that development of those teachers that are already in the classroom towards the end goal that we want to achieve?
Absolutely. I'm going to hold that question as we get into the law and talk about that, though. Yes.
My question builds on both Ms. Holton and Ms. Creasy. Just on the higher, we talked about this at the last meeting. What do we know on higher ed? Are we going to be doing any surveys or anything there just on sort of adoption of these practices and how they're being then incorporated in teacher prep programs?
Yes, that we're working with Dr. Johnson, and we'll look at both the kind of the current landscape, both sort of looking at how many candidates you're producing, how those candidates are doing, kind of what the educator preparation looks like, and then also looking at some of the mechanisms around program approval and how you what shifts, if any, are needed there. We're doing that type of landscape analysis now of higher ed. All right, so
I had a question.
oh, sorry.
Me.
Yeah, of course, yes.
Is there a curiosity, and it could be either of you, is there a curiosity in the department to see what's happening outside the box, maybe collaborating or partnering with non-public schools to see what kind of education preparation, what kind of mechanisms they're using, how they're doing, and kind of builds on what Ms. Holton asked about, surveying what others are doing, just to see, is there a curiosity to see, obviously there are different skill levels, different educational preparation, and different progress being made children all over the country. So is there a curiosity to go that way?
I think we're very open to looking at different models, both within the state and across the country. I mean, the good thing is, even though I know Virginia educators prefer to learn from other Virginia educators, there are other states that have been slightly ahead of us in terms of implementing these laws, thinking about this training, thinking about how you support educators. And instead, I think we'd be very open to hearing from others and looking at kind of models as we explore. One of the things you'll see in the VLA is this idea of us playing a role in vetting and sort of naming kind of curriculum that work well. We'll talk about the same with some of the professional development. And so if there's models or things we should know about, be very, very curious to learn more.
And even if it's within Virginia, then, in the non-public sphere, to see how are private schools doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Can work with Grace on that. Excellent. All right, let's get into the law itself, and just so I can answer Ms. Creasy's question as well. So really exciting law that passed last year, the Virginia Literacy Act. It's comprehensive, it's multi-pronged. I think it sort of calls on us to collectively do the work that Dr. Mann articulated, passed in a bipartisan way by Delegate Coyner and Senator Lucas, unanimously out of the General Assembly. So it just really kind of creates a positive energy. There's funding to support this work. I should note, full implementation is expected by the 24-25 school year. So again, as I said earlier, this will be the first of many of our conversations today. And this does not replace EIRI, right? But it's sort of intended to complement it, as well as sort of think about, as Mr. Rotherham noted, the kind of importance of thinking about what this implies for education preparation. I'll go into detail on this, but I think it's really important. Again, you're going to hear me use this word over and over again about sort of thinking systematically. It's not just enough to think about classroom teachers or families or higher ed. You've got to think about both the teachers that are coming into your system and the educators that are currently part of the system. And what does the ongoing professional development look like? And making sure we're putting the research at their fingertips and giving them the tools on evidence-based literacy instruction, right? And really supporting that across the board. The law is a long one, and I won't read every word on this slide, but there's a couple of key things I think it's important for this board to understand. I think first it defines evidence-based literacy instruction and science-based reading instruction, right, to kind of create in a world where there's lots of definitions of science of reading, what this means for Virginia. A big shift is calling on this board and the department to take a more proactive stance on saying what are high quality curriculum, core curriculum, screening, and intervention materials, and to produce a list or a guide on what those materials are, and then begins to require all of our K-3 classrooms to use those. It says we need to continue to use our statewide literacy screener and make sure that we are tracking kind of progress over time. And then also says we have to make sure that there's sufficient reading specialists. And I think that's really critical when you think about the challenges of kind of being an educator right now, making sure it's not all on the shoulders of the classroom educator, but there are also specialists who have more sophisticated training and experience to support classrooms. To Ms. Creasy's point, it says we cannot just think about the pipeline. We have to look about the educators that are out there now. Going broader than the educators, we have to think about the principals, the teachers, the reading specialists. I know as we've shared this, we've also said we got to think about the central office staff. We got to think about the aides, like everybody who is touching the classroom, making sure that they get this professional development ongoing, not just one and done, not just a summer institute, on the science-based reading research and this evidence-based literacy instruction. It requires us to partner with families and kind of really create these student-specific reading plans, as well as think about putting these resources at parents' fingertips to support them as they are supporting their children to read. And then to your questions, Mr. Rotherham, really saying we've got to take a look at education preparation, sort of establish a clear landscape, and then making sure that we are aligning all of our systems from licensure to education preparation to program approval so that candidates who come out into Virginia schools are fully prepared to use evidence-based literacy instruction to teach in K-3.
Yes.
I just have a quick question on the previous slide, Jenna, if you could go back. What is it that you see is the difference between supplemental materials and intervention materials?
So, and we will sort of define this specifically as we take it in the reviews, but sort of generally kind of core is like the sort of enough to cover kind of the core ELA block every single day. Supplemental is kind of covering certain skills or additional areas, and then intervention are really the sort of the most sophisticated, intensive supports for those children with sort of specific identified needs.
Consultant.
On the reading specialists, can you help me understand how what was passed as part of the Literacy Act compares to our SOQ prescription for reading specialists? In other words, have we got what we had recommended as what was done as part of the VLA solved what the board had recommended as part of SOQ prescription or not yet?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that we have done analysis and that it looks like we currently have sufficient reading specialists to meet this requirement, but I can go back and look at kind of what you all
And it may be that it's a K-3 versus higher grades question, but that Ms. Balo, if that when we talk about the annual report this afternoon, there's an area in an annual report that talks about our SOQ prescription on reading specialists, and I was lacking in clarity on it. But my question here, it would be helpful to have that answer when we talk about the annual report.
I am going to work on that.
Thanks.
I had a question.
Ms.
here.
Dunn, please.
A couple of questions. One is on that first slide, maintains the current screening model. Can you just very briefly, what is the current screening model?
Sure. So this was formerly which is known as PALS. It's now known as the Virginia Literacy Screener. It's in partnership with Dr. Solari and the Virginia Literacy Partnerships, the Office of Virginia Literacy Partnerships. it is currently going through an overhaul. So yeah, as of a year or two ago, I think there was an acknowledgement that we needed. Oops, we're good to go. Somebody is watching us. So this is it was known as the PALS. It's now the Virginia Literacy Screener. We are overhauling it to bring it up to date with the kind of the best research, going back to Mr. Gecker's question earlier, kind of really making sure that it's a screener, that it kind of identifies some of the most important reading difficulties earlier on. So it's a multi-year effort. We're piloting it now. It's a pre-K to second grade tool. We're also doing a Spanish version, and we're piloting a bunch of the different measures now. We'll come back, and then we'll begin to scale it next year.
Thank you. And how do you really implement the partnering with families for the development of the student reading plans? How do you intend to do that?
So I think it starts with some of the questions you all asked earlier about sort of currently understanding the current state. I mean, we've had, for example, kind of a set of conversations internally, even about, the extent to which families receive their literacy results now. And there's quite a bit of variability kind of both within, not only kind of across the state, but even within school divisions and even within school sites. And so I think this kind of first understanding kind of the extent to which what schools are or not currently doing around supporting their educators to support families to understand where their kids are at. So we're doing that type of kind of analysis now. And then I think really thinking through from the kind of what do families need to know sort of about the science of reading. Literacy Partnerships, for example, has a set of resources for families on there. As you start to roll out curriculum and look at some of the guidance around using high quality curriculum, what sort of is relevant for families to understand about the curriculum you use day in, day out, the supplement and the intervention materials, and also helping understand, okay, not only how is my child doing, but like, what do I do about that? And I think if we have variability right now, and even kind of, do you get your results from your kids, like beyond, there's sort of a difference between just getting the report card, but actually getting the kind of, the screener or the assessment results, and then what do I do with it? So this will also, Ms. Dutta, take a sort of an agency-wide approach. We'll work with the Office of Parent Engagement. We'll work with the school divisions. We'll have, as I'll talk on a little bit later, about families on the advisory work group to kind of help us support and think differently about this. But I think we'll first try to get an understanding of where we are, where the gaps are, and then begin to address those.
And just like a quick note was that when my kids were in elementary school, like parents would sign up to come and read outside of the class, but to read one-on-one with other kids, not just their own children that some parents are able to do at home, but they would sign up on a day. There would be a stack of books and they would do one-on-one reading with the child. They would probably accomplish 5 to 10 kids in that day, but things like that. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's also, to Ms. Holton's question earlier, sort of identifying what are some of the models or bright spots where this is happening, and also sharing that across the board. But I do think the law is pretty explicit that we need to be more proactive about what information is getting to families, and not just where kids are at, but like what we can sort of do to help families, guardians, and parents take action based on that too.
Thank you.
Mr. President, I would even encourage us that there are some wonderful organizations out there. I was on the board of Reading is Fundamental for probably 10 years, and the level of community engagement, and sometimes we get a little bit caught up in the right type of reading or the right science, but there's an awful lot of pockets of the ones that we're trying to reach where just supply is important, intervention is important, and I'm sure this is going on, but I think working with some of these types of organizations, but also I think to some of the previous comments, even waging a bit of a campaign, if you will, to let parents understand, where we are, where we need to be, but also, its impact for them personally. And I just have 16 grandkids in the system right now, and I'm just not sure how much reading is emphasized, especially for the K through 3 students, of having parents understand that this is the most important thing with all of the other things that their students or children are in school for right now, that they need to be taking ownership over in any which way they can. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think sort of, the families say, yes, I know I need to read nightly, right? 15 minutes or whatever else. But like beyond that, as we do have better data and information on children, how do we make sure that that's actionable for families? And I think that's a great point, Mr. Hansen. And we talk a little bit about, we will include a community-based organization on our advisory work group as well, and really thinking about where can we partner, where folks have existing relationships with families, have done some of this work. We do not need to reinvent the wheel there. It's a great point. Okay, so one of the things, it's a lot of law, and again, I think the key takeaway was articulated earlier. It's a significant amount of work and lift for us, for our partners. We cannot do it alone. No single office or division at the department can do it. We need to partner with higher education. We need to partner with families, school divisions, educators across the state, and obviously with kind of at the core centers of our work. As I've gone out and talked with folks about this, and I think thinking about this question around wow, this implies change in work, how can we make sure that this resonates with folks? I think it is helpful to have a vision on what will be different as a result of this, beyond just the kind of a compliance. What does the law say that we have to do? And so we've put out, one-pagers and had conversations. And I'll say, quite frankly, this is where I get the most sort of head nodding around, where people can agree on the importance of this. And I think that the key piece is, you'll notice the word on these slides, the every. And I can't state that enough, right? A shift from kind of a targeted intervention approach to literacy to really sort of saying a comprehensive, every student, whether you're in Southwest, Nova, Tidewater, Southside, here in Central, everywhere you'll go, that folks will be using a high quality approved literacy curriculum for their core literacy curriculum across all of those classrooms, the entire block, and that we will know kind of where kids are using our screener, and then have plans in place, right, with involve families, involve educators, involve the reading specialists if kids are not at the benchmark. And this is a big shift for Virginia, which is really sort of said, we've approved things in the past, primarily kind of textbooks, but now this is really sort of assertively saying, and it will be this board that ultimately approves kind of the list of curriculum that need to be used in classrooms across the state. It will remain a local choice. I think that's important to note. I do not see the resolution, nor does this law ever call for a singular curriculum or a singular supplement or a singular intervention. Choice is important. Engaging sort of not only school divisions and educators in that choice is important, as you think about kind of what a big deal it is to change curriculum if you are in a situation where you're not currently using something that's approved. It means that every K-3 teacher, right, needs the supports to be able to use high quality curriculum, to transition to said curriculum if they're not using it already. They need to be able to support it to regularly assess using the literacy screener and other supplemental tools throughout the year, and that they are really then supported to kind of use that data, and really the kind of reading specialist playing a key role to coach and support to identify the needs. I mean, one of the things you hear from our K-3 teachers right now, who are dealing with so much, is that there's just never been greater variability in the system, right? As a result of the pandemic, you have first graders that look like kindergartners and first graders that look like third graders. You have second graders that look like kindergartners, right? And second graders that look like fourth graders. And so really trying to figure out, how do we give you strong core materials, right, to organize your day and support your intentional instruction in both the kind of the word recognition and linguistic comprehension, but also, address the variable needs of your students. And to the point that Ms. Creasy noted, that we're really recognizing we have a lot of teachers in the system. So while we have to fix and address the pipeline, we also have to provide supports, ongoing supports to those educators that are in the system. every reading specialist. We'll make sure that there's more of them and there's sufficient one. And they're really kind of partnering with classroom educators to support the needs of the kids who are not on track, not on target, and doing that in collaboration with teachers and families. They also will be critical ambassadors of kind of how do you not only take a training or a set of trainings on evidence-based literacy instruction, but turn that into practice. And I know you've heard a lot about that. I know Dr. Siebert and his work in the schools, right? It's like one thing to have a training, right? And then you know, how do I use that next Tuesday and next Wednesday and next Thursday? And we see the reading specialists playing a critical coaching role. So not only supporting, all right, here are the kids with the most identified needs, how are you thinking about addressing those kids, but also supporting sort of more broadly, how are you using this evidence-based curriculum? How are you applying day in, day out what we now know about the science of reading? It means for our school divisions that each will have a literacy plan, and that they'll be kind of readily available information to your question, Ms. Holton, on what curriculum they're using, what supplemental materials, what intervention materials. They are making sure across all of their classrooms that approved curriculum is being used and used consistently, making sure they've got sufficient staff. They're partnering with us, so as we'll talk in a second, we'll offer some choice around the knowledge-based training, either a sort of a statewide option, or if you want something that's off a sort of an approved list, but they're making sure that they're getting it we sort of start off with teachers, reading specialists, and principals, but the more we talk with school divisions and folks, they say we got a whole array of people who support the classroom that we need to make training, and then we will be hiring through regional literacy partnerships, regional literacy coaches for this year, up to 8 to kind of support school divisions and to support the reading specialists. So kind of different tiers of support across the system. Ms. Dutta, to your questions, or what does this mean for families of K-3 students, I think a real focus on making sure that there's readily available information on sort of how kids learn to read, assessment and curriculum, so they can support children's literacy development at home, as well as looking at models in terms of volunteering and kind of connection, working with community-based organizations. And again, making sure that there's a sort of, an action step, an action-oriented reading plan for those kids who are at risk, if they do not meet literacy benchmarks.
I have a question about that, if I may.
Please, yeah.
So there was, in a local division, they gave free access to tutor.com, and what they found, survey, that only 1.2% of the students, less than that, were actually using it. So it's a free service out there, purpose to raise the learning loss and other, reasons, but online resources are not always used very well. I feel that there's more like a more manual, face-to-face interventions are more helpful. Thank you.
No, I think that's a really important point. And so I think the minimum is to make sure that they're available, but I agree. I mean, ultimately, teachers are such critical ambassadors to families and thinking about kind of what gets sent home. If you use a platform like Class Dojo or, one of those ones, making sure that, that you're sort of, you're basically equipping educators to sort of do some piece of making these resources available, because you're exactly right. You might build a website, but it does not mean that they will come. And so I think we'll look at how to tackle that. And then as we look at the educator prep programs, again, getting to a place where across the board, across our incredible set of higher education institutions across the state, that there's some consistency in making sure that the coursework, the assessments all line up, and that candidates who come out of these programs are fully prepared to be effective in our classrooms using high quality curriculum and materials. So this kind of goes without saying, and maybe I've belabored this point, but it really, truly, it is a lot of work, and it takes a series of partners, slightly overwhelming at times to think about this. But I think it's important to recognize that this is such a comprehensive law, because I do think, we've done, to sort of some of the points made by Mr. Hanson, Ms. Holton, Dr. Mann, we have done pieces of this in Virginia, for sure, right? I mean, Virginia is a sort of a forward-thinking state, and so it's not as though we have not done any of this, but we haven't necessarily done it in a comprehensive way that's focused on all kids, all classroom, all educators, all families. And that requires thinking broadly about, from our policymakers to our community-based organizations to higher education, how do we all work together to tackle these challenges? So, okay, so what does this mean in terms of implementation? So we've begun, as soon as the law was signed, we've beginning working on this. We have an extensive Gantt chart and project plan and all of the things that kind of organize our work internally. The top priorities for us beyond getting the word out, and we've done, Superintendent Belo has done webinars, we've been out there speaking to superintendents and elementary school principals and school boards associations and others. But the key thing to get up is we've got to establish a process, a rigorous multi-phase process for evaluating these materials so that we can bring lists to you all for approval. We're starting with core curriculum, and then we'll move on to supplemental and intervention materials. And basically, it's, we'll talk probably next month in more detail about how this looks, but really kind of running a very rigorous process so that you all can trust when we bring materials to you for approval, that they've been fully vetted, fully checked, and that if approved and used in Virginia classrooms, that they will be the types of tools that support our educators to be successful. We'll also this year be developing guidelines and tools for the student-specific reading plan and thinking about how we roll that out, and sort of even thinking on some of those questions about how do you get this to parents and engage families on that, not just sort of an after the fact there. And Ms. Creasy, we're thinking about right now the statewide training. And so really there's kind of two pathways here. One is which we'll bring a list to you of some of the national folks that are approved to do this training. This is, again, we are not the first state to do this. There are a set of vendors who do provide kind of this knowledge-based training. We'll take a look at those. We'll be able to say, here's a list of folks who do that well. We also know that's expensive, that's time consuming, that's variable, and so that won't be the only option. Instead, we'll be partnering with Virginia Literacy Partnerships, Dr. Solari and her team, to develop a statewide option that will sort of be oriented with a set of literacy coaches at UVA who will then be sort of assigned to reading specialists. And then we will create kind of a hybrid model that there'll be online content to be supported with in-person kind of coaching and support over time. So there'll sort of be some activity in the summer, and then there'll be kind of like a monthly module plus, involving the reading specialist in-person component. And so that will allow us to get some scalability. It'll allow us to design a tool that works well for Virginia educators. And it also will allow for some redundancy. So we know that, you might have a teacher who's there, but the next year you've got another new teacher, right? And so kind of really making sure that we've got a model there. So developing out those modules. Virginia Literacy Partnerships has already developed some of those, and then really thinking about the literacy coach to reading specialist model that allows for an in-person component that sort of both gives some individual coaching, but also helps connect really the application of the information in the classroom day in, day out. So two options there. One will be the state model, and one will be the kind of off-the-shelf products that are available. And then lastly, starting by towards the end of the year on the guidance and tools for the literacy plans for the school divisions. What does this mean for you all? So the first box you can check today, you're becoming familiar with the VLA and the timeline activities. We will talk with you at a future work session about the kind of curriculum material process. I'll bring Dr. Solari in, and we will get into the weeds about all of the steps that we're taking and how we're working with hundreds of Virginia educators across the state to review lots of materials before we bring them to you. But ultimately, this body will need to approve a list that we will then turn around to school divisions and educators and say, you've got to choose from this list. There'll be several rounds of this, so we won't just get this one meeting done or two meetings done, but we'll bring to you sort of several sets of this. We will also similarly bring to you a list of the knowledge-based professional development. So again, you'll approve a list of kind of high quality national vendors, and know that that will be an option for school divisions in addition to the statewide options, and potentially summer into next year, guidance for the student-specific reading plans and the division-wise literacy plans. So again, bringing materials, some of the materials articulated in the law to you all for vetting and approval before rolling out to the field. When you look at other states that have done instructional material reviews, I just want to kind of clarify, there will be multiple rounds. And really what we will do is spend a lot of time working with you to kind of believe in our process, because it's a lot of work to kind of review and make sure that these are top-notch materials, and want to, and obviously there's lots of stakes here, right, in terms of like vendors and educators who care about these materials. And so really making sure that you feel confident in the process that we have embarked on when we bring these materials to you. For the school divisions, right now they're focused on awareness. There are resources, and we work closely with Virginia Literacy Partnerships to make sure folks who want to get this underway now, we're trying to understand, as Ms. Holton asked about, who's doing this well, kind of these pockets across the state and how we can learn from them, but kind of spreading the word about this. We've asked them to submit their curriculum. And so we've got a set of curriculum that are already in the process of being reviewed. Those can be commercial products, or they can be curriculum that developed by educators within school divisions. So we'll take both for the reviews process. And then we're beginning to orient them on understanding that these new things like the student-specific reading plans are rolling out. We're working and running numbers to help them understand on the reading specialist ratios and making sure that they're covered there. And again, we'll start to roll out plans for the training, starting with the reading specialists next summer, and making sure that they are getting all of their reading specialists, into that training starting next year. So a lot of preparation for next year. We've been asked this question a lot. Does this mean we have to use approved curriculum in the 23-24 school year? The answer is no. Again, remember, full implementation is 24-25. So we don't want people just to sort of put it off for a year and a half, because deciding on and implementing a curriculum takes time. And that's why we're moving urgently on the instructional material reviews process. But just as a reminder, the full implementation is not required until the 24-25 school year. And then that means we've got a lot to do as well in 23-24. So multiple rounds coming to you all for approval on core curriculum, supplemental and intervention materials. We'll be rolling out the statewide training, getting to all of the key constituencies, reading specialists, educators, principal, aides, and others. At this point, we'll also, Mr. Rotherham, really be working with higher ed, partnering with them to kind of begin to say, how do you, sort of understand where we are, what changes are needed. That may also be things we'll bring to the board, probably not this year, right? But in future years, if there are changes needed to program approval or licensure. And again, really making sure we're pushing out tools in the 23-24 year that we expect school divisions to be using in 24-25, noting, as Mr. Siebert knows, these are battleships. You cannot shift them overnight. And so trying to put these tools at school divisions' fingertips sooner rather than later as they support the implementation. Yes, Ms. Dutta.
If I may ask a question. I had a question about, in one of the previous slides, talked about statewide training beginning in summer 2023. So what kind of trainings and how would it be implemented for? This is for teachers. These are for reading specialists. So
yes.
What kind of training are we talking about?
So this is what we're calling knowledge-based training. So some of the training on evidence-based literacy instruction and the science of reading. And so there'll be two options. There's a set of vendors that already do this, and we will bring a list of you of those that we think are high quality, and you can improve those. And school divisions can choose if they would like to use those for their reading specialists and their educators and others. We will also provide a statewide option, and that will develop in partnership with EVA and Virginia Literacy Partnerships. And the law calls on them to hire a set of literacy coaches who in turn will support reading specialists. And so we'll develop these online modules. And then we will do the kind of in-person. So you can almost imagine your online module, and then there'll be sort of a guide that will support the in-person work.
Like a conference or?
So I think there might be some sort of conference or institute-like events to kick off, but I think what we've learned when we look kind of nationally at best practice, that's just not sufficient. So we're trying to think about what's a scalable, sustainable model that is not just kind of a quote one and done, but that would get to folks periodically over time. And so that's what we're designing and building out right now.
Thank you.
Is it helpful? Yeah.
Just go ahead.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
I was just maybe going to follow up on what I mentioned earlier too, where I think it'd be beneficial and maybe the outreach to parents and kind of the communication or campaign awareness for them understanding what's coming and what they can also be doing. I think especially as it gets into the third bullet on evaluating those students which are not, and maybe the subgroups or others as well. It just seems like that ought to be part of the key activities for the divisions to make sure that there's a component for that, or whether it's folded into several of these. So.
Absolutely.
Consultant, please.
I'd be interested about the plans to begin to work. When are you planning to begin to work with the EdPEP programs? And in particular, I have heard from some of my colleagues that there's a group of literacy literacy specialists from the EdPEP programs around the state who are eager to begin to engage with you all. And I know you're swamped, but
Absolutely.
are you, they've been reaching out.
Yes.
Are you going to be able to engage with them soon?
We are sort of engaging with them. I know some of folks from the department have met with the VCLE and sort of engaged there. We're answering questions as we speak and supporting them. Where possible, and we'll talk about engagement in a second, we're asking folks to kind of weigh in on bits and pieces. So for example, right now, 50 plus of our partners in higher ed are actually reviewing one of the rubrics and offering us their feedback this week in response to them saying, hey, we would like a chance to take a look at this and suggestion. And so we're revising the rubric that we'll use for phase 2 of the instructional materials based on their fantastic feedback. So I think we're trying to think both about how do we engage them more broadly on the VLA activities that are occurring right now, and then working really closely with Dr. Johnson about the sort of the education preparation too. So kind of both aspects, right? Both as experts in their field around some of the stuff that's more relevant to the day-to-day practice of school divisions, and then also on the educator preparation program pieces too.
Ms. Creasy.
Sorry, another question for you. So are these timelines on the division, what we have as far as division-wide kinds of timelines? We have a lot of very conscientious and very ambitious school divisions that are probably chomping at the bit to have some more defined timelines out there. Where do we see those coming so that they can start to prepare themselves and get everything ready from their perspective?
Yeah, no, I think so I would say, Ms. Creasy, the most urgency and an understandably and well appreciated question is, when is this list coming out, right? And the extent to which really kind of understanding, for both aspects. One, am I currently using something that's already approved, which has a pretty significant impact on implementation? And then you're more thinking about kind of the training and making sure it's every last classroom. And if not, that's a really big lift, right? To sort of imagine a shift in curriculum across all of your K-3 classrooms. So our goal is to bring the list to you all by the summer. I will say that our superintendents would have liked it to be sooner than that. When I shared that with them last week, and there was some visible and oral notification of their slight frustration with that. On the other hand, we have to get this right. And I think really making sure that they're the right phases and the right rigor. We've involved, as I'll talk in a second, hundreds of Virginia educators in the review process. These are really lengthy materials. You think about kind of what a core curriculum is and how many hours it covers over 180 days, a full school year. It's just a lot. And so as we get that process underway, it is helping us understand more specifically when we think we can bring you lists, how many rounds we're going to need so that there's a long enough list and a sort of sufficient enough list. And so we know that there is an ask out there for a more specific timeline. We want to get a little bit more work underway, but we know that it's there, and that will be helpful.
Anybody else?
So we've got Dr. Solari on the phone, and I just really want to emphasize this really important partnership with the University of Virginia Literacy Partnerships, having kind of national experts. In addition, we're partnering more broadly with higher ed. So it's not just about working with UVA, but we're explicitly working with this group. This Virginia Literacy Partnership is in charge as you asked about earlier, Ms. Dutta, of our Virginia Literacy Screener and has been for a long time in the Commonwealth. And what we are also doing is funding them to support this work. So it is a big lift for the VDOE. It's taking all of us to support this, but we don't have the full expertise and capacity. And so being able to count on experts to help us develop this process, to look at the national best practices, to make sure we have high quality rubrics that we then have shared with other states. We've done this before. We've shared with Virginia educators, and we've shared with, as I just mentioned, Ms. Holton, Virginia higher ed, really important and kind of building this capacity. Similarly, on the training, we need to bring in experts to help us develop a model that sort of meets Virginia's unique needs, scalable, sustainable, and it's, we simply don't have the capacity at the VDOE to do that. So we are partnering very closely with Virginia Literacy Partnerships. They're helping us develop this process. At some point, we will bring it back into the DOE as they help us develop this capacity, learn how to do it. We'll take over the tools and the templates, but they're helping us run it right now. And they're, for example, also engaging hundreds of Virginia educators. They're going to help us design the statewide curriculum, make sure these modules are high quality. They'll help us develop the template for the reading plan and provide sort of the technical assistance to divisions, and they will hire and supervise the literacy coaches. So again, really important that we're bringing in top talent, not only within the agency, but working with partners to do that, and really thinking about how we get the best in class resources. This is critical, and this will help for cohesion and alignment, that they're also in charge of literacy screeners, so that you have, when you think about the importance of identifying kids and aligning kind of identification with instruction, making sure that this is cohesive. What you don't want to have is being like, here's an assessment that evaluates one thing, which is totally disconnected from what we sort of value in the curriculum, which is disconnected from the training that educators are getting. So really focusing on expertise, capacity, and alignment as we do this work. So not only kind of across these multiple divisions within VDOE, a big lift for us, but then working closely with Virginia Literacy Partnerships and funding them to do this work so that we can learn from what's done in other states, but also design something that works best for Virginia. They also, because they've run the screener for years and years, to your point, Ms. Holton, they have a good relationships on the ground with many Virginia divisions. And so again, being able to highlight some of the bright spots and places where people are doing as well.
Mr. Keffer, I did.
Yes, please.
Just one follow-up question to the conversation earlier about PALS and leading indicators, et cetera. If we had the PALS charts showing change over time, would they show basically the same trend as NAEP and fourth grade reading shows of stable, then beginning to drop before the pandemic, and then dropping with the pandemic, and then starting to come back after the pandemic? Or do we know that yet? And if that's not an easy answer, I'd love to have you all if you could get us those PALS charts at some point, that would be helpful.
Emily, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I can briefly respond to that. So yeah, it really is very much the same trend, where we had some increasing levels of children below benchmark right before the pandemic. And then of course that number shot up in the middle of the pandemic. And then we've had some, what we're calling a bit of recovery, especially last spring of 2022. There were fewer children below benchmark, although it's not back to pre-pandemic levels. Does that help?
Yeah, yes. And if I understood correctly, you said there was, as with the other trends, there was some, what I would characterize as stability before the pandemic, and then a drop within the year or two before the pandemic. Would that be?
That is correct. Yeah.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Any other questions for Dr. Solari? We've got her here too.
Please, Dr. Siebert.
So on this topic of Virginia Literacy Partnerships, my question is, to what extent and what capacity are, again, obviously UVA is in the lead here, are we bringing the other higher institutions involved in this? Because first of all, they need to be at the table. Secondly, when it's time to put boots on the ground and make things happen in division, geography matters.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think that's critical, and I think that's both a role for the VDOE, and that I know as well Dr. Solari also engages and has had conversation with these various groups. So I'll talk in a second. It's a nice segue into engagement. We are going to create a a Virginia Literacy Act advisory work group. And we started by naming, so we said we have at least one higher ed partner, although they've asked for it too. And so we'll making sure that we have higher ed partners as part of that group, meeting at a minimum quarterly to walk through these things, have folks at the table, help us kind of kick the tires on, okay, what is working and what are we missing, and how do we think differently about that? So making sure all the groups are there: higher education, community-based organization, families, reading specialists, middle school, early childhood principals, chief academic officers, school boards, out of school time, quite a bit. Received over 185 applications for this group. Yeah. The only thing that was more popular was to be a reviewer with Dr. Solari's team for the curriculum review. So a ton of interest from Virginia educators, which is just super exciting and mildly overwhelming. But we are kind of pulling that group together in December, and we will make sure that higher ed is featured there. We don't think that's where it ends, Dr. Siebert. I think also as we think about these, really the sort of the literacy coaches that will be part of Dr. Solari's team, is thinking about kind of, how do we also have folks at a regional level who are kind of convening and partnering, right? Not only working with the reading specialists, but also thinking about how do we interact and intersect with the higher ed and community college institutions in those regions. I think that's really, really important. And looking at, sort of similarly as we get aligned curriculum materials, and we're thinking about supports around curriculum-based professional development, and looking at kind of which higher eds, really putting data, for example, at higher ed's fingertips on here are the curriculum that are being used within your broader catchment area, and how are you supporting that work and aligning if you've got candidates that are coming out of your institutions and using those. So I think there's multiple opportunities for partnership kind of beyond just the work on educator preparation. So we will launch advisory work group next month in December. We've had real success. We've done something similar on the PALS task force and bringing folks together across the state. We'll make sure all the superintendent regions are reflected. We've got a diverse set of stakeholders, and kind of, making sure we're getting insights from that group. As I said before, Regional Literacy Partnerships sought application for folks to be reviewers, and we received nearly 200 applications there. And so the approved materials that we will bring to you will have been vetted by Virginia educators and Virginia experts. So I think that's really important. We've got a separate task force that we engage on the new literacy screener, which is great. We had the opportunity to participate actually and talk with those folks a week or two ago. And Ms. Dutta, that was the group where we realized that we had such wide variability in what parents know now or kind of have access to, whether it's volunteer opportunities or knowing whether or not they even get their PALS results. That was a question I would imagine, Mr. Hanson, if you were to ask for your 16 grandkids, like just do a survey of who's in, K2 and who, whether they got the PAL scores and, whether that was explained to them, and just even the engagement around that. We just see tremendous variability. And that was something that we learned really through the task force on the screener. And then we've been on a bit of a roadshow, and we'll continue to do that in these early stages, really thinking through both making sure folks are aware of the Virginia Literacy Act, what it calls for, what success looks like, and then to both Dr. Siebert's point and Mr. Hanson's, thinking about opportunities for partnership. So something this big really takes all of us, and I think we remain curious and open to, have you thought about doing this, or have you heard about this model, or is there a way within this community that we can do this? And I do think every time we've gone out and spoken, I was out in Southwest, out in Abingdon 2 or 3 weeks ago, and sat next to an incredible elementary school principal from Galax, and we were talking about the lift around curriculum and shifting curriculum. She had just, in response to some of our early childhood efforts, changed her pre-K curriculum, and talking about the importance of engaging educators around that choice and their excitement around it. And it was this helpful reminder for me around, beyond the compliance and the enormousness of this law, like if you can get people excited about it, there's nothing more than a principal or an educator or family member wants than to help that kid to learn to read. And so we, on this roadshow, are continuing to look at additional partnership opportunities and thinking outside of the box around how to engage as many people as possible as we seek to implement this over the next 3 to 5 years. Whew, I thought this was gonna be like 45 minutes, but you guys must be starving, and that might help me in terms of, wrapping up questions. But let me pause there, Mr. Gecker, and see if there's any additional
Any other
questions for me
questions?
or for Dr. Solari. Thank you all so much. I know this
thank
was a
you.
lot of information. So
Thanks very much.
wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for the great work.
Okay, I think as it has been noted, I think we're up for lunch now, right? Yes. So we will take the break. We're 25th floor for lunch.